Good evening, everyone. So, last presentation of the day before Paul Oakenfield. And everybody's coming to watch GRC stuff here. So, title of the presentation is Run Your Security Program Like a Boss. We're intending to give practical governance advice with a few great tools actually being released at the end of it. So, stay tuned for that. So, a little bit about us. I'm Justin Leapline Rockie Brockw. We both work for Trusted Sec. You might have heard of them. They have a few t-shirts coming around here. So Justin Leapline, his profile is way better than mine. So I'll just let him hand off.
So this was last year DerbyCon. This was at the, and I don't think the guys are here this year, but this was at the RV of Doom party. I don't think they are. No. But yeah, this was probably about 2:30 in the morning, and you kind of get the picture.
Especially since my eyes are closed and everything along that line. So, but anyway, so diving right into the talk. So one of the big things, the challenges of the organization is everybody agrees that there is a shortage within the industry. As in, 2015 Global Information Security Workforce, there's 1.9 million shortage coming up to 2019, just a couple of years away. But an interesting fact about that, it's not necessarily just a shortage of people. It's actually a shortage of talent, as a lot of you probably know. When you're hiring for people in the industry, it's not that I just need a body to fill in this seat and get it rolling and everything. It actually comes from the experience of the people. Having a good mindset, having a challenge-oriented mindset, looking at that experience, having a broad range of technical versus managerial knowledge with that. So another quote for that is the IC Security Survey. Looking at that the actual shortage is actually people of experience with that. And if you actually look at another study of this, most of the actual skills that people are looking for aren't actually technical knowledge. Actually, that's down fourth on the list. From a technical knowledge perspective. Most of it is actually, a broad understanding of security, communication skills, which is vastly lacking in our industry, and an awareness and understanding of the actual threats out there. So looking at that, we're looking at all the different stuff out there and how to actually bridge that gap with it.
Thank you. Right, so, as most of you are probably aware of, we have a lot of frameworks out there, and they're a bitch, right? They're a bitch to really kind of wrap your head around, depending on whatever industry you're in, etc. Right? So from that perspective, that's a horrible thing. We're gonna introduce another one, but it's really dope. So the goal for this talk is really to oh, and we forgot our presentation mode. Oops.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out. Whatever. Goal, right? The goal for this talk is to try to see if we can put together a unified framework for security that is based on security, as opposed to compliance and or regulatory / best practice, right? So let's focus on that, but here's a way that we can measure ourselves against all this that then provides valuable data back up into the business in terms of metrics, in terms of communication and things of that nature. So what we're going to do, I think, first of all is, and actually any additional, because again, we forgot our presentation notes.
Yeah, so,
additional goals.
And also to introducing a couple of different good practical advice on running a governance program. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that. And then at the end, like I said, we're going to be introducing a couple of tools that mainly geared to small, mid-sized businesses. Obviously, some alpha releases, but they have great potential to help all companies out there.
And to borrow from Fuzzy Knop's talk earlier today, it's alpha AF. So a couple of things here. First of all, some core requirements for building a valuable security program. Obviously, we need to understand what our audience is, and the audience has to include the business side, obviously, right? So obviously, there's technical and operational bits of data that we're going to have to work with, but we also have to also translate all that into business relating data that the executive teams and the boards can understand. So what do those metrics look like as well? We want to talk about what are our priorities, right? So we want to talk about, data classification, mapping assets into the most critical business services, things of that nature. Understanding our environment, they really kind of go hand in hand, but we'll kind of get into some details there, and then metrics. So
know your audience. So one of the first things coming into it is understanding where your executive management is coming from a security basis. And I'm sure you guys are all familiar with the questions that come down to this. How many times have you heard, are we going to have a breach? Are we in risk of a breach? I mean, that's one of the first questions that executive management outside of security will actually come down and say, that they're concerned about. Your goal as a CISO is no breaches, type of thing. And I'm not saying that that's a good thing. You have to critique that understanding with it. But how do we compare to others? How much cost is it for us to be safe? Type of thing. Was the gap between now and ideal was the biggest threat out there? These are all common executive questions that come down to it. And they're good questions to understand where, the executive management is what's paying us to actually operate in the company. And it is a part of a business culture. We just have to incorporate that and twist the logic into, it's not about whether we have a breach or not, it's about mitigating that risk of a breach and minimizing it to the smallest effect that it is based on the cost, resources, and everything. And we'll get into a little bit about that.
Sure. So this slide is actually, I've been kind of ranting about this for a number of years at this point, but at the end of the day, almost all organizations understand that protecting their business critical data is important. However, they go about it wrong, right? And the ways that they typically go about putting together a security program is either on a project by project basis, right? So we need to replace the new firewalls or, blah, 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 whatever the newest technology is. They are pretty, yes. Or they're looking at their security program from a compliance perspective, right? And again, from a security curmudgeon perspective, you've heard this before probably a zillion times. If you're compliant, you're probably not secure, but if you're secure, you're almost always going to be also compliant. But the reality here is that the protection of business critical data needs to be treated as a function of the business. And so this is really kind of the foundation of how we're putting together kind of like this, not only the framework and the tools, but also just from an organizational perspective, this is it's our responsibility, right? Everybody in here, it's our responsibility to ensure the protection of business critical data for whatever organization you work for. So we're going to try to work backwards and solve this.
So, yeah. So one of the aspects is know your environment. So once you actually figure out a lot of the priorities, and one of the things we didn't mention was, if you're a newbie into a security program and you have a lot of managerial experience into that, or existing and want to improve your security program, one of the things I absolutely recommend going through your organization, going back on the priority, is going to your executive management and actually having a conversation with them. And it's more of a bridging gap. You figure out their priorities for security, you figure out their needs for security, you figure out their pain points for security. And going through that and actually getting that priority and then saying, is there anything else I can help you, enable you to actually, run the business and everything. Then going into, once you get to kind of the audience piece of it, looking at, your environment. So first thing, absolutely do an assessment. You need to know your current state and environment to what you're dealing with. So vulnerability, application, program maturity, physical, knowing what you're existing with. We're talking about assets, we're talking about data, we're talking about process. Everything where, security kind of impacts, which is essentially everywhere, getting that realistic aspect to the current state is what is absolutely needed to go to the next step with that. So, first thing first, identify your assets, do a full catalog of that. You will not believe the Fortune 500 companies that I've walked into that doesn't have any semblance of a CMDB. It is all over the place. They don't know where all their assets is, and it's absolutely necessary for anything to do with security. We're in a conversation actually just this previous week with a big banking client, and just assessing the risk in their environment when a vulnerability comes in. They could not actually achieve that because they didn't have an accurate inventory to what they were actually existing. They said they had about 60% in their CMDB. The rest of it is internal knowledge, people that actually dealt with the information every single day. Identify your data. Going through, assessing where is your data stored, where are all those endpoints with it. One of my main focus in TrustedSec is actually dealing with PCI data. One of my first priorities is realizing where is that data being stored and transmitted. First priority when doing an assessment, with this. And it is amazing the companies, large companies that I'm sure almost a lot of people in this in this room here actually do business with, that just don't have a good handle on their data and where it's actually touching. Going through engagements like this, you start identifying additional resources that the whole security and risk team had no idea that that process even existed and where their data was going.
I'll add a little bit, to that from a like understanding where your data is and what your data is. Data classification is critical, right? So data classification standards are a must from from a security program perspective, but specifically understanding service ownership. Right, so fine, the IT director may own email and maybe DNS and things of that nature, but who owns that portfolio, right? Who's, at the end of the day, accountable for that suite of services, that portfolio? And then being able to, once you gauge what those business critical assets are, or what the actual business critical data is, then mapping to those assets that support that data.
Yep. And literally that picture right there, I have walked into offices where it actually looks like that from the IT manager. It is amazing. I actually asked him if this was an all-purpose storage room, type of thing. He's like, no, this is my office, type of thing. And Rocky hit on some of the service portfolio mapping, but then, and then once you get the service portfolio mapping, once you have that asset mapping it back to the applications that actually serve that. So, and this is especially important on business continuity, disaster recovery planning, that if I have an application that is critical to the business, what systems are actually involved in actually processing that data and need to be up, for that. So mapping that back and having that relationship to it is critical for them. Sure. Right? Yeah.
So from an overarching risk management perspective, the right side of this slide is really kind of one of your, let's call it a typical risk management model, which needs to include identification, analysis, things of that nature. Your mileage may vary. You may have other risk management models, but at the end of the day, we want to kind of highlight some of the specific things out of whatever risk management model you happen to choose and happen to like. Some of the things that we feel is, exceptionally critical to ensure that you're getting out of those models, right? Defining and aligning the risk measurement categories, making sure that your teams across the board are utilizing a standard, right? Whether it's high, medium, low, blah, 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 but we have all of these various tools, whether it's vulnerability management, whether it's EDR, whether it's whatever, that are generating data and generating risk metrics. Well, that's not a risk metric. Your vulnerability tool is not generating a risk metric, right? So what really ends up being critical for a security program is to understand, okay, we've got all these sources that are providing us all these different types of risk or whatever scores, but we need a standard that can take all of that, put it into something centralized or something consistent, some standard, and now our teams across the board are using the same thing, right? Utilizing, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so, and this is especially important because you're going to get a whole bunch of data from a lot of different tools and everything. So to align that is going to help your communication process. So when you get a CVSS score 1 through 10 from your vulnerability management tool, you can translate that into the business risk by aligning it into your agreed upon measurement categories. You know, so there might be outliers, but if you have a mapping process to go into your standardized process, it'll be so much better from a communication point on this is the true risk to the business and escalate it up when that happens.
And a couple of the other ones, you know, here, taking a look at from the perspective of utilizing your own evaluation criteria, defining expected actions based on categories. But at the end of the day, from a risk perspective, this is really kind of, you know, again, risk assessment. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, right? You can walk into an organization and say, I'm going to perform a risk assessment for you, and go through a NIST or a ISO 27000, you know, analysis, but I'm of the opinion that that's not true risk from a business perspective. So what we've done is kind of step back and said, okay, we're going to define a business risk assessment. And a business risk assessment includes these 4 things. Right? You have to have an understanding of what is important to the organization through a business systems analysis. So that means we're working with an organization at a leadership level, at a management level and again, everybody thinks that their little part of the business is the most important part of the business, right? So we need a pretty decent sample set to get a good idea to, you know, kind of mean it all out and understand what are the most important parts of an organization, right? So first phase is what's important to you, right? And we're going to we work through that process with, again, different layers of the organization, but absolutely including leadership and board, right? Next, phase 2 is adversary analysis. Who else might be motivated enough to try to take your important stuff? And if feasible, again, this kind of goes into like threat and attack intelligence, and some of that data might not be out there, but some of it might. If feasible, what are those actors' capabilities? Because that's going to be an incredibly important portion of the risk formula. The third is adversary simulation, right? This is your standard either pen test, red team, purple, however you want to do it, but you know, make sure it's done right. But this is how your important stuff can be stolen. So now we have what's your important stuff, business systems analysis. Who else might want that, adversary analysis. How can your stuff get stolen, right, adversary simulation. And now we have everything we need to actually calculate likelihood, right, probability. And then if that were to happen, what's the business impact? What's the financial and or quantitative / qualitative, you know, potential bad results if that stuff were to happen? So I'm going to walk through a very simple qualitative example. And this is simple stuff, right? This is just Excel. So business systems analysis is going to start with, or has to start with, an understanding of an organization's loss threshold, okay? So if you're a $2 billion company, if you're a $10 billion company, if you're a $100,000 company, whatever, right? We have to understand what are your thresholds for loss. So let's work with leadership and you know, the executive teams to understand that. Now we're going to basically, through this kind of interview process with management, with, you know, sub-executive, executive, board, what have you, we're going to work through and figure out what are the top 5, 10, probably 10 is about as much as we really want to get into, but what are the top 10 critical systems for that business? And again, everybody thinks that their little slice of a business, of the business, is going to be the most important. So we get enough of that so we can mean it out. We talk to them in terms of what would happen if this service were down in relation to degraded customer service, public confidence, blah, 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 right? Non-compliance with contracts and SLAs. And what would be the, and again, this is a qualitative example, so what would be the potential impact to the business in these particular situations based on this particular critical service, right? So now we get a bunch of these and we mean it out across, you know, 10, 20, 40, 50 individuals, depending on the size of the organization, and come up with basically what we have here is probable loss magnitude, right? So when we mean it all out, this system, if it were to go out, the mean results for email, a loss of email, in this particular situation, that was based on the actual loss threshold that we defined earlier. This is a high probable loss magnitude. So now let's go through a scenario where we've executed an attack simulation and we've actually derived adversary metrics like motivation, adversary sophistication. The adversary sophistication is directly related to the type of attack that was able to breach this particular system, and in this instance, it's an SAP breach and a theft of organizational intellectual property. But this, and this, to be, you know, this, I actually was going to say, to be fair, it is fair. Does anybody know what fair is? Right? So this is actually a bastardized version of the factor analysis of information risk. So we're taking instead, and what we've added into this is really more on the adversary analysis than anything else, right? So we're taking a look at that motivation perspective as a variable of risk. But at the end of the day, we now have the ability to calculate based on the probable loss magnitude through our interview sessions from the business systems analysis and weigh that against loss event frequency, like how often might this actually happen based on your existing controls that might be really good or might be really bad, as well as adversary motivation and the actual sophistication required to execute that particular attack simulation, right? Successful attack. And and now we can base from all of this data, now we can boil that down to in this particular instance, in this particular attack, with this motivated actor and things, everything that we see here, what's the actual business risk of this for the client?
Metrics. So one of the important things that we talked about a lot of the developing the data, understanding your environment and everything, but one of the most gapped things in a security organization is developing those metrics out to the organization. Because even though you're doing a perfect job on security, how many times have you heard management saying, well, what are you doing for my organization? You're just a cost-sunk, environment there, type of thing. So you need to be producing those metrics that actually show that you're providing value to the organization and to the agreed upon risk tolerance to the organization. So, and there's a lot of bad metrics out there, If you've seen any security metrics out there, there are a ton that just equate different things, put some numbers together, and they come up with a total and say, this is critical to the business.
This is your Nexpose and CrowdStrike and whatever, all the different tools that think they're measuring risk and adding them together.
Yeah. Even though it might be on a isolated DMZ internal network that only the admins have access to, you know, type of thing. Yeah. So, but before we can actually measure the core metrics to our organization, we need to actually create what our measurements are for the organization. So it's important to actually put what are those measurement stakes? What are we actually putting into the organization that we are actually saying, are we meeting it or are we not? And I just hit the wrong button.
Okie doke. So, introducing is in quotes for a good reason. We're, quote, introducing the enterprise security architecture, but the enterprise security architecture, which is the model and framework that we're using for this particular, you know, set of tools and framework that we're presenting here, is a decade old. And a guy named Gunnar Peterson, at the time, who worked for an organization called Arctech, put together the enterprise architecture blueprint white paper, and that was released in 2007. So this is essentially what the framework, how the framework is laid out. This, starting with an organization's stakeholder goals. Now, and this is exactly where we started with the business systems analysis, right? So understanding what's important for the organization, right? But that's essentially stakeholder goals. So that's that business systems analysis that we illustrated as part of a risk assessment. It's the same thing that we can then apply here, right? But starting with stakeholder goals, we have 3 pillars, foundational pillars for an organization's security program, right? So we've got risk management, we've got policy and standards, and then we have security design architecture. Those 3 pillars are supported in various ways, in some way, shape, or form, et cetera, by a set of processes, right? So in this instance, it's defined as the software development lifecycle, if you're doing application development, identity management, vulnerability management, and threat management, right? So those are the overarching processes, right? So obviously patching and things of that nature falls into vulnerability management. IR and SIM monitoring and things of that nature, that falls into threat management. And then a set of defense and depth controls, which we are, you know, everybody's typically familiar with things like firewalls and antivirus as an endpoint control, firewalls as a network security control, et cetera, right? So then the defense in depth is what we normally, you know, are used to seeing from a security perspective when we talk about controls. And then metrics, and metrics is something that almost all organizations suck at. And so we're going to help hopefully try to fix all this. But at the end of the day, we've got these 3 pillars, and they are supported by processes, defense in depth, and metrics. Sure. Yeah, right. So domain reporting in that particular, I'll go back, and domain reporting in that particular instance would be equivalent to, let's say you're accountable and responsible for like the DNS server, or you know, some part of the IT and or security infrastructure, but it's a specific domain specialty, right? So what we've done here is 2 things. First is we're using the ISO 21871 2008 process maturity model, right? So and it's defined right there, right? So not performed, performed informally, blah blah blah. So we've taken. Is anybody familiar with the ASVS, the Application Security Verification Standard? Anyone? Okay, cool. Then this will be great. The Application Security Verification Standard is an OWASP, and don't hate me for that, but it's an OWASP framework where, and it technically, I think it was a splinter group, right? It was almost a result of the OWASP top 10 / top 20, whatever, kind of being rather difficult to actually and efficiently implement. So they put together this framework that broke down application development into different sub-domains, right? And each of those domains, you had the ability to kind of customize yourself in terms of, okay, where do we want to go with this? Do we want to do level 1? Do we want to do level 2? Or do we want to do level 3? And level 1 was pretty much, meh, okay, you know, we're going to do, you know, maybe we're small and we don't have a lot of money and we can only do this. Most organizations, quote unquote, most organizations try to get to level 2 from the ASVS perspective. And then level 3 is very advanced, right? So critical infrastructure, DoD, et cetera. So we took that model and applied it back to these processes: SDLC, identity management, vulnerability management, and threat management. So, that's kind of the framework that we're basing this on. We're doing a combination of the capability maturity model, the ISO capability maturity model, and taking the enterprise security architecture framework itself and then applying the ASVS model to it. And this is just a sample of just the threat management, right? So you can see we've broken down it, you know, it's really big at this point, but the sample here, you know, you can see the incident response, threat simulation, documentation, and metrics. What you can't see is the 3 columns over to the right. That's level 1, level 2, and level 3, right? So obviously the level 3 column, everything is going to be a requirement because it's really, really hard. But this is kind of the framework that we've applied to all this entire enterprise security architecture model itself. And each of these tabs for identity management, threat management, vulnerability management, blah, 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 includes the defense in depth controls as well as the metrics, right? So you can see down here, the last section, 8 metrics, right? There's a whole bunch of different types of metrics that we have, right? Verifying the mean time to incident detection is being calculated, verify the percentage of techniques detected by actor sophistication level. So that's a really interesting one, and I'm going to put credit where credit is due. Oops.
I think, yeah.
Okay. All right. Oh, yeah, actually, I do remember that we flipped this one. Credit where credit is due is coming. But one of the other things that we wanted to make sure that we got right here is that, okay, there are a number of frameworks that a lot of organizations are beholden to for whatever reason, whether it's government, whether it's, you know, you're in the medical industry, blah, blah, blah. So by going through this, and this is just one example here, right? So in our threat management, you know, worksheet, verifying a basic 40-hour penetration test is performed annually is a level 1 and level 2 and level 3 requirement. And in this particular instance, the result from the organization using the capability maturity model was well-defined. So well-defined is like a mediocre yellow type, you know, color code. And this is still a work in progress, but we're mapping all of this out to like the ISOs, the PCIs, the HIPAAs, as best we can, right? Because a lot of times those specific, if we, you know, we're trying to get into the specific weeds of, you know, making sure that we're taking a look at this from a security perspective. And a lot of times the compliance and or regulatory and or whatever best practice frameworks, they don't have that level of detail. So we're mapping it as best we can. But you can see that in all of these instances for here, because it is being done, that automatically checks the box, right? The yes, you know, for PCI, the yes for NIST, the yes for ISO. But we're also color coding that specific element, that specific description within that specific framework, so that the organization realizes that there really is still probably some more work to be done, and we're not relying on just a yes, no, right? At the end of the day, it's really easy to say, do you do vulnerability scanning? Yes or no. But it's much more difficult to say, what's the maturity of your vulnerability management process? And this is what we're trying to tackle. Credit where credit is due, from a threat management metrics perspective. A couple of guys named Chris, both, named Chris Gates and Chris Nickerson, did an amazing talk at DerbyCon last year. And that's the link. Take a picture of that link and watch it. It's fantastic. But they basically put together an entire talk on utilizing red and blue tactics to break things down from a penetration testing execution standard perspective, right? And then testing the organization to see in, credential access and lateral movement, in persistence, here's the different ways that we can do all these things and whether or not they detected each one of those. And they built out these amazing, sets of matrix results that at the end of the day, you can do things like this, right? If you're talking about sophistication level of an adversary, and how many of those attacks falls into each category, whether a novice can execute it, whether a practitioner can execute it, blah, blah, blah. And then testing the organization to see what's the percentage of novice attacks that they detected? What's the percentage of expert attacks they detected and whatnot? So again, credit where credit is due. It's fantastic, and we built this into the metric sections of the vulnerability management process as well as the threat management process. Whew. Okay, so that's technical metrics. It's obviously also very critical to establish and communicate back up into the business via executive level metrics, right? So, risk findings, incidents arising, compliance results, these are the important things for the business and leadership. We personally may not find them as interesting, but it's critical for our program success, right? So, you have anything, want to add anything there?
Yeah, so, and it's important when you're talking about metrics that you split it off into different groups, because there's various groups that actually have different interest points into what you're measuring with that. So we talked about executives, we talked about board, and they're entirely different audiences when you're actually delivering metrics. There's oftentimes, even if you get an audience with the board from a security perspective, you literally have 15, 20 minutes, to actually go over this maybe once a year, maybe twice a year type of thing, if you're lucky. If you're more than that, great. The board actually takes a serious interest into that. Most times, it's not that way. But even if we're talking about executives and boards, we're talking about even the operational statistics. So you agreed on as a company that you're going to address an incident within 1 hour time of actually that event being notified. How are you measuring that? Are you meeting that goal? Is it communicated back down to your team that's actually performing that? So it's an accountability from up and down, perspective. So getting those metrics, measuring it out, and putting it out to the audience and say, this is our measuring stick. Does it need to change? Sometimes it does need to change. And looking at that and saying, how are we operating as an organization from a security perspective, and adjusting from that perspective. So, we have a couple of great tools to release out to this. One is the enterprise security architecture. I'm going to go from bottom up. You've seen a lot of that content that actually Rocky has actually presented with that. There's a lot of those metrics, and we're actually going to do a little demo with this here. Another one is a Pisky. I've been working on it for quite a few months here. It's actually an open source GRC tool. It's the alpha version to that, but it helps you actually from a web portal perspective, actually track, manage, and overlook the compliance status to your organization.
That's alpha AF.
AF. So, we're going to do a little demo time here. So, you're first. Yeah, sure thing. Yep.
Yeah, actually, from a compliance or from a mapping perspective, we're definitely going off a lot of that work that's already been done. Yeah. Auditscripts.com. Yeah. Yep, exactly.
Definitely check it out. Auditscript.com.
Yep. Okay, so this is just, again, this is just a spreadsheet, right? It's got a bunch of tabs. This is actually, where's the, back here?
There, but you're on
Oh yeah, that's right, sorry, my bad.
So on that GitHub resource there, and we can
I,
pull it up again.
yeah, I haven't figured out a great way to actually like change control an Excel spreadsheet, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I'm probably not looking hard enough, but at the end of the day, this is kind of a working model that I have in Google Drive. And then when I kind of like apply changes and updates, I'll put it up to the GitHub. Feel free to, you know, clone the GitHub to get the spreadsheet itself. And if you wanna contribute to the actual, you know, development of it, you know, I can DM me on Twitter or email me, and you can. I'll give you, you know, I'll give you access to the Google Drive. This is the ASVS itself, just for, you know, just for kind of understanding where we came from. You know, and the ASVS, again, it breaks everything. Why can't I?
He's a new Mac guy.
Oh, whatever. Anyway, look up the ASVS, because apparently my two-finger scrolling is inferior. Why do you?
That's
Yes,
down.
down. Okay, thank you. Anyway, okay. So you can see the different types of things that the ASVS is looking for from an app dev perspective, just for reference, right? So, okay.
Good. Yeah.
So software development. Here's threat management, starting with the organizational type things, going into like backups, logging, monitoring, and we already saw a couple of these others. Vulnerability management, and at the end of the day, you can see that. Each of these has the maturity model, kind of, you know, how are you doing in relation to this specific thing from a, you know, and again, looking at it from a security perspective. But the way we're then doing this is, depending on what level you actually want to be at, whether it's level 1, level 2, level 3, that choice will then determine scoring, right? So you can see here that there are actually 15 in this particular threat management maturity spreadsheet. There are only 15 requirements for level 2, for level 1. For level 2, there were 77, and for level 3, there were 98. And it will automatically, depending on where you actually want to get, where you actually want to shoot for, it will automatically calculate that particular, maturity model level, which then will go back to the main page and color in that specific process, right? So again, with threat management, with vulnerability management, identity management, there's still some work in progress around design architecture and things of that nature. So this is obviously, again, alpha AF, but that's kind of the walkthrough of this tool. And so once you go through this process, once it's actually not AF, and it is more of a beta, will be, by going through this entire process, this will give an organization a heat map of the enterprise security architecture and where focus should be, put focus on, and help the organization, from a business perspective, be able to prioritize things appropriately from an actual security-focused security program.
Fine. All right. So next on the down here. So one of the other things that we actually put in place here. So my inspiration to this was that, as you guys know, there is a lot of GRC tools out there. This isn't new to the game. And of course, I can't type in my password. And to that effect, there's a lot of expensive GRC tools out there, which is the problem. A lot of small to mid-sized companies that actually deal with compliance on a day-to-day basis can't even imagine actually spending money, 50, 100, 150 grand on something just tracking their compliance applications and everything. My actual last job before joining TrustedSec was actually dealing with PCI almost all year long, dealing with actually directly with card brands, dealing with PCI DSS, as a lot of you are familiar with, and most of my year, 3/4 of my year, was dealing with compliance issues. And then I had a quarter year to actually improve our security program. And it was always reactive incidents. You know, it was always, okay, let's dive into this audit. Let's make sure, hopefully, all the controls are still being followed, that I'm relying on IT, management, business processes that I set out before. Hopefully, they're still in place now, you know, type of thing. So my goal with this tool was to actually put a framework together to actually help organizations to download, track all their controls, track all their compliance, track all their findings, and put a little bit of accountability out to the organization. So Episky was developed. It's open source right now. It's out on GitHub. You guys took the pictures with it. Go look it up. So first dashboard, we just have some basic stuff right now. Just the top risks identified in the organization. If you're logging in as a user, if you have any assigned findings, and assigned controls from an ownership perspective that you're responsible for. So looking at this, there's a number of different categories. I'll just go over it real quick. Authoritative sources. This is the big parent ones here. So if you're loading in that you have to do PCI data security standard, HIPAA, enterprise security architecture, we load this in. There's a basic framework actually in the controls folder up in GitHub. That's a CSV folder. It takes one command to upload any controls you want into this framework here. And just looking at it, there's some basic data. Don't hate me on it. But you can upload it, you can change it, you can do whatever you want to it from a change perspective. Going into the risk part of it, you can identify risk. It's very basic right now. This is alpha release. I just wanted to get something out that you can actually start cataloging it with it. The controls with this, you got your authoritative source with it, the actually identifying versioning of it. Pages, pretty good. If you go into like showing it, you can actually assign resources to it. You can add a description to it. It's all pretty dynamic from the source here. So, going into the findings, if you want to identify a new finding with this, you can actually catalog that with it. And then you can actually upload evidence to different things. Right now, it doesn't actually tie to the controls. Ran out of time for the presentation, but this is one of the main goals to this. One of the other main goals that I didn't get enough time to actually contribute to this presentation, but will be in very soon within the next couple of weeks, is actually putting in testing time periods to each of the controls. So if I have an ACL review that has to happen, you know, twice a year as recorded for PCI, with the owners, they will actually get tickle requests that actually say, I need to, you know, attest to this and or update evidence to the portal. So when you go into audit time and you're in governance mode, you can actually track when you can actually see when stuff comes due, when things are overdue, so you can start chasing down individuals to say, I expected this result and I haven't seen it yet, and I don't want to get out of compliance with it. And then there's a dynamic search with it. So if you want to look up with all the controls you actually have uploaded to this, anything that has badge related or anything that has incident response related, you can actually easily pull those requirements out to it. And easy add and alerts that come into your user account for this. So my main goal to this is actually to have organizations that don't have a lot of budget, have a lot of compliance needs, and really need to actually track a lot of their compliance, regulatory, security program goals into this and, you know, achieve this actual risk metrics. The future goal in integrating with ESA is actually to get to that well-defined perspective where you can actually measure different controls and how they're actually rated within your organization, as well as do an intermapping between a lot of these authoritative sources. So you can have one corporate standard and then actually source different authoritative sources with this. Again, this is the first time this has actually been publicly released, so I'm actually really excited that, you guys download it, use it, let me know, what your thoughts are. Yep. Symphony. You sound depressed. So yeah, I wanted to do something, a well-defined framework. PHP is one of the most common, obviously, frameworks out for a web. So if there's any people contributing, that it would have the widest popular source, with that. And it is, obviously, there's always security faults in all web stuff, but it is CSRF protected. It is checked with all the, the user roles and everything along that line. So it's good framework from that perspective. So I really enjoyed programming this. So at this point, any questions? I think we only have a few minutes left before we have to break down.
One quick thing is that the kind of a longer term goal is to actually the enterprise security architecture stuff that we've shown that are all spreadsheet based. We want to get it into this tool, right? So that'll be a really nice one-stop shop for all of it. So yeah, that's.
And it's literally a one command thing to import this. As long as you have a CVSS with the right headers on it, it's 4 headers right now, it could be more. As long as you have the right format to it, it's one command to import it into this tool. Cool. Any questions? Yeah. You're talking about this tool right here? Alpha, AS. Yeah, no. Yeah, so, and this is kind of a general thing, like, obviously there's a lot of tools that have a lot more capabilities than this, but this is open source, so if you have any roadmaps or suggestions or anything along that lines, please log it in the, in the GitHub findings, and we'll prioritize it and get it in there, so. Huh? What?
You want to put the PowerPoint back up?
Oh, yeah. You weren't interested before, now you are? Oh, okay. Yep, no problems. There you go.
Cool. Yes, sir. Say that again? Bit sites? Oh, bit site. Oh, technically, I'm not familiar. I haven't used that bit site. Okay. Yeah, I'm unfamiliar, so I'll look into that, absolutely. And if it's something that makes sense to, begin adding to these types of frameworks, awesome. But yeah, unfortunately, I'm not, I don't have that experience. Any other questions? Awesome. Hey, thanks for coming.